Hi everybody, Pete Sartes for The Lawyer You Know. We are back for a Theranos Elizabeth Holmes trial update. This is week 5. A lot of big blows for the defense in the last few days. We're going to go through all of that. But before we do it, again, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you're enjoying this series, please subscribe. That being said, please leave me comments. And in fact, if you want us to do a live on this particular topic, put a blood drop emoji in the comment section. Obviously, the more of you that are interested in us doing a live will dictate whether we do it or not. But with that, let's talk about Theranos Trial week 5. All right, let's do a recap on where we are. Last time we did a video, there was a gentleman by the name of Adam Rosendorff on the stand. He's a medical doctor. He was the lab director at Theranos for about 18 months. And if you remember from the previous video, he was on the stand. He has been on the stand now for 5 days. 4 of those days, he has been subject to cross-examination, which means he has been asked questions by Elizabeth Holmes' lawyers. Now, if you remember, again from the last video, Mr. Rosendorff or Dr. Rosendorff testified that he felt pressured to vouch for tests that he did not have confidence in, and that he felt obligated from a moral and ethical perspective to tell the public what was going on with the company. In fact, Dr. Rosendorff was the one that broke the story to a guy by the name of John Carreyrou, who, if you remember, was the guy that literally wrote the book on Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. The book is called Bad Blood. And in fact, John Carreyrou had indicated, but for Adam Rosendorff coming forward, he really was the catalyst that brought this whole case to fruition, and really was the reason that John Carreyrou was able to write the book. So where are we now? The defense has spent the last 4 days beating Dr. Rosendorff up. And I'll tell you, based on what I'm seeing, they're doing a pretty darn good job of discrediting him. And I'll tell you, let's talk for a second about what cross-examination is. For those of you that don't know, the government put Dr. Rosendorff up on the stand to testify about, there were things I didn't know, I was out of the loop, these things were being done right. It was so offensive to me that after 18 months, I walked out on Theranos. I couldn't do this anymore. Well, the other side of the coin is that the defense then has a right to come up and cross-examine, which means they get to ask questions of Dr. Rosendorff to either characterize his testimony or to clarify some things that may not have come out accurately or the way the defense believes they should have come out in the government's direct examination. So let's talk about it for a second. The defense's job is to create reasonable doubt. And the way you do that is by discrediting the government's witnesses so that there is a reasonable doubt that Elizabeth Holmes may not have known or intended to defraud anybody. So that's their job. And I'll tell you, in the last couple of days, they've done a pretty darn good job of it with this particular witness. So let's talk what happened. When cross-examination began, Dr. Rosendorff was asked a lot of questions about specific meetings that he had had with Elizabeth Holmes, where he indicated that he wasn't sure, he didn't remember certain items. In fact, in one set of questions and answers early on, Dr. Rosendorff kind of got a little snippy with Elizabeth Holmes' defense lawyers and said, look, man, it's been 7 years, I don't remember. But what the defense did is they asked a couple of questions and got some answers which were pretty benign. But then, what did they do? They pulled out a bunch of meeting minutes from corporate records that were kept. They pulled out a PowerPoint presentation and a series of old emails that made Dr. Rosendorff look less than credible from my perspective. One of the key issues that the cross-examination focused on was whether or not proficiency testing, which is a legal requirement to ensure that the blood test equipment was running accurately, was valid or not. Dr. Rosendorff, during direct examination, when the government was asking him questions, testified that although he'd come up with a plan for proficiency testing, meaning does it work correctly, but it wasn't implemented. In direct examination, again, he testified that management, i.e. Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, were not willing to perform the test, and it was a major reason why he had quit the company. So the defense winds up showing him a series of documents that proficiency tests had been performed at Theranos on all the FDA-approved machines. Let's be clear, that is the stuff that is already commercially available, meaning the machines that test blood that we've been using for many, many years. Those have proficiency testings, the FDA requires it, and the documents demonstrated that Theranos was in fact testing that piece of equipment. What was not tested was the Edison machine, and the reason is that the Edison machine didn't actually have an outline for a proficiency test yet at that point. But again, based on the emails provided by the defense lawyers to Dr. Rosendorff, it appeared that there was a plan that was drawn up back in December of 2013 that showed that there were proficiency tests that had been developed. In fact, not only had they been developed, but in March of 2014, the corporate board meeting minutes demonstrated that that proficiency testing that had been written up was discussed at the meeting, and that they were going to implement these proficiency tests for the Edison machine, which again, you remember, is the technology that Theranos was touting was capable of testing everything from diabetes to HIV with a drop of blood. So, in the continuation of this particular topic, defense lawyers for Elizabeth Holmes pull out a PowerPoint presentation. And this PowerPoint presentation was approved by Dr. Rosendorff. In fact, the document indicates that it's a PowerPoint that was created because of Sunny Balwani's request, produced by someone who directly reported to Dr. Rosendorff and approved by him. And here's what it says. The slides were frankly pretty easy to understand. They weren't hyper technical or anything, or just kind of like a summary presentation. And the summary presentation had indicated the following. Number one, for the Edison machine, there was no peer group for comparison when it came to how they should do this proficiency testing. The reason is their technology works very different from the technology that exists and has been in use for many, many years. Because of that, the normal standard proficiency testing that had been produced over the course of, I don't know how many years, was not effective for the Edison machine. In fact, one of the issues was that some of the agents that are used to proficiency test these machines that are in existence weren't compatible with the Edison machine. And let me just be clear what I'm talking about. When you test the machine, there are a series of vials, for example, that have a known amount of a known substance, and you put it in the machine to make sure the machine is reading exactly what you already know is in the little vial. Well, that doesn't exist for the Edison machine. Therefore, what had happened is they had to produce a series of alternatives that Theranos apparently had actually developed was superior to the traditional testing proficiency test that the other FDA approved machines, meaning the stuff that was commercially available, were using. So that being said, they had already developed the appropriate proficiency test, and it was readily available for the lab at Theranos. So lawyers for Elizabeth Holmes ask Dr. Rosendorff a very specific question. When you got this slide or series of slides, this PowerPoint presentation, when you got it, did you have a reason to question the accuracy of the slides, meaning the PowerPoint presentation, at the time that you received it? You would think this would be a simple question. It's either a yes or it's no. Apparently, during this trial, there was a long pause. And after a long, and I would suggest to you, uneasy pause, Dr. Rosendorff's response was, I think the slides reflected what I had written in the document. Kind of an odd response. It's either from my perspective, a simple answer would be, I approved it, this is what it said, we thought it was accurate at the time, or I didn't think it was accurate at the time. Well, which one is it? And this answer of I think the slide reflects what I'd written, kind of I would call it a subvertive answer. All right, the second big topic where I believe the defense scored some good points with Dr. Rosendorff was regarding pregnancy testing. And if you remember 1 or 2 videos back, we had a witness that an ARMP testified, and also a patient testified who happened to also be a medical professional, that had had a number of miscarriages, that she had been sent to have her HCG levels tested to confirm the viability of this pregnancy. The test results seemed to indicate that that her pregnancy was not viable, and there was issues about whether she was going to abort or not. She didn't abort. She in fact had the baby, and the baby was healthy, which is wonderful. In this direct testimony with Dr. Rosendorff, there was an email in all caps that said all tests for pregnancy purposes were supposed to be run on FDA-approved devices, but that wasn't done. On Friday, we saw emails that told Dr. Rosendorff, let me be clear, emails to Dr. Rosendorff from people in the lab indicating that Edison, the Theranos machine, was going to be used for the pregnancy hormone tests, but Dr. Rosendorff indicated he didn't know anything about that on cross-examination. Well, the defense shows him the email like, well, of course, not only did you know about it, but you actually made the determination that they should be using the standard FDA-approved, commercially readily available equipment in order to test for this hormone. How do you forget something as substantial as this? So that was, I think, a good shot for the defense. Let's talk about issue number 3. Patient complaints. All right, in direct testimony, the government showed Dr. Rosendorff some emails from Christian Holmes. Now, remember, Christian Holmes is Elizabeth Holmes' brother, and Christian had written an email to Dr. Rosendorff indicating that they were having a lot of patient complaints and that there should be, obviously, something done about this. The intimation from what I see was that the complaints were partly because the testing done by the Edison machine was not accurate. But hold on a minute. The interesting part is Dr. Rosendorff was not included on that chain of emails that Christian Holmes sent. In fact, the complaints that were being lodged were done because there was something called a reagent, which is, again, a chemical that's used in the blood testing process that causes the machine to actually give you a result. Apparently, that stuff was backlogged, meaning Theranos didn't have it, meaning they could not perform the test. So in direct examination, it came out as if there were a lot of complaints on these hormone tests, these pregnancy hormone tests, because they weren't accurate, but it's not that they weren't accurate. The complaints are, it looks like there were delays because they didn't have the proper chemicals in order to perform the tests accurately. I think there's a distinction between one, making it look like Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos were running tests knowing that they were not going to be accurate, as opposed to we couldn't run the test properly because we didn't have the chemical equipment necessary to do the test. So we shall see how that's going to work out as it's going to play itself out with other witnesses. One of the underlying themes during Dr. Rosendorff's direct examination with the government was that he was frustrated because he, as the lab director, was not being kept in the loop. He didn't know things were going on. No one was copying him on the emails. Well, not necessarily so, says Elizabeth Holmes' lawyers, because during, again, another series of questions, they asked Dr. Rosendorff, had he ever complained about the fact that he was out of the loop? In fact, he did. Not only did he complain he was out of the loop, he sent an email to upper management saying, hey, I'm the lab director. I need to be in the loop on these things. And from that point forward, it appears as if Dr. Rosendorff's now included in all of the emails regarding at least the topic of these pregnancy tests, because they started including him on the emails. So he, for all intents and purposes, was on notice about what was going on and the fact there were issues. Another big blow, I think, for the government, and a really good job for the defense team this week, was the question about whether or not the company had a policy regarding outliers on the testing that they were doing with the Edison machine. Theranos did not have a written policy for how to eliminate something called an outlier. Testimony basically says that you get a bunch of results, you get rid of some of the results, and then you average whatever's remaining, and that'll give you a more accurate representation of what you're actually testing. Apparently, even though they didn't have a written policy, Dr. Rosendorff, again, the lab supervisor, the guy in charge of all this, had produced his own policy. And the policy was the policy was something called a 6-tip policy. And what does 6-tip policy mean? What the testimony is that Dr. Rosendorff said, when you do blood samples, you get 6 readings. You take 2 of those 6 readings out, you average the remaining 4, and that is going to give you the result for whatever you're testing for. Now, the problem seems to be with the accuracy of some of these tests that the information that Dr. Rosendorff provided to the lab technicians wasn't thorough enough. So they were not sure exactly which 2 outliers, or I should say it this way, they were unsure as to which 2 readings were the outliers so that they could eliminate them from the calculation. And in fact, we take this one step further. Not only did the lab technicians not know which outliers to use, when Edison failed a pharma evaluation for some specific blood tests, 7 to be exact, the lab director, Dr. Rosendorff, was the one that cleared the Edison machine to be used in order to process samples in those 7 different types of tests. So, back up, what am I saying? This is the guy that created the test. This is the guy that set forth how the testing was going to be run on Edison. This is the person who is the lab director who apparently cleared tests that were not approved based on different pharmaceutical evaluations or pharmacological evaluations. Again, I think good blows for the defense. Next big issue that I thought was interesting is there are some alternative assessment procedures that had been put into place for the Edison machine. What do I mean by that? Because the testing that the traditional, readily available, FDA-approved machines was not sufficient for Edison, Dr. Rosendorff approved a series of alternative testing procedures to make sure that Edison was working properly. Here's what's interesting about this. If you all recall a couple of episodes back, a lady by the name of Erica Chung indicated that the Edison machine was going down all the time. They were spending, hours and hours trying to recalibrate machines, and that there were people literally sleeping in their cars in the parking lot waiting for the recalibrations to happen in order for the Edison machines to go back online so they could do tests, which was backing the whole lab up. But wait, Erica Chung was not using Dr. Rosendorff's alternative assessment procedures in order to recalibrate the Edison machine. That's a testimony this week, and that seems to explain why a lot of these Edison machines were failing their quality control because, again, Ms. Chung was using the quality control procedures established for the commercially available FDA-approved products, the stuff that tests blood now, and not the procedures that Dr. Rosendorff had set up as an alternative specifically for the Edison machine. I think that's a big deal. I think the fact that the person whose job it is to run this lab is not disseminating information to the lab technicians, and they're having problems to a level of they're sleeping in their cars trying to get this stuff to work is a huge deal. At least it looks poorly on the person, in my opinion, who's in charge, which is the lab director, Dr. Rosendorff. Another big issue that he, I think, had some answering to do was concerning physicians' complaints. Apparently, he was also in charge of fielding physician concerns and questions about lab testing done at Theranos. In October of 2014, Dr. Rosendorff was forwarded some emails concerning physicians who wanted to speak with someone in the lab about specific patient results. Apparently, those physicians called and emailed and never got a response. The problem being Dr. Rosendorff is the person who is supposed to be answering their questions. His testimony on direct was, look, I didn't want to give them any more information because I didn't have any more information. The results were inaccurate, therefore I didn't know what to say to these people. But he didn't pick up the phone and say, hey doctor, I am not confident in your test result. Go do another test at a different lab or use a traditionally or commercially available test. He just said nothing. He just avoided all these phone calls altogether. Again, is this an issue of Elizabeth Holmes taking it upon herself to not disseminate this information? Or is this a matter of Dr. Rosendorff, who has been tasked with this entire area since he's a medical doctor, to communicate with medical doctors, and he's not responding? Does he take it upon himself, meaning he removes that decision-making from Elizabeth Holmes, and therefore, if she didn't make that decision and didn't know about it, how could she have attempted to defraud somebody by not taking action? So we'll see how that plays itself out. Today in court, though, and this is something that's going to play out in the next probably day or so. By the time I film this, I didn't have an answer to it, but I can only do so much to get this out to you timely. An attorney for Elizabeth Holmes actually approached the court and said that they want to present evidence that demonstrates that Dr. Rosendorff is, and this is a strong word, incompetent. And what we found out today was that Dr. Rosendorff has apparently worked at 3 other labs. And those 3 other labs have records of deficiencies in their result reporting. In fact, one of those labs is a company called uBiome. And uBiome actually has 2 people currently facing criminal charges based on, again, fraud. And this is a company that Dr. Rosendorff worked for that he may have neglected to disclose either in his discussions with Theranos and for sure in his discussions with prosecutors. They didn't know about this. And defense attorneys seems to have discovered that he in fact was working for a company that he didn't disclose to prosecutors, where there are people being accused of fraud because of false or inaccurate results on their testing equipment. We will see how this comes together. I think that the judge at this point is in a tough spot. He has indicated he's going to take this matter under advisement. He is going to make a decision whether or not Elizabeth Holmes' lawyers are going to be allowed to ask Dr. Rosendorff a series of questions in front of the jury about his other, let's just say his track record of success in other companies he's worked for. We'll see how that plays out, but I think that could really be catastrophic for this particular witness. The second person in 5 days to take the stand is a lady by the name of Victoria Sung. And Victoria Sung worked for a company called Celgene. Celgene was a big pharma biotech company that at the time, we're now talking back in 2009, 2010 timeframe, was developing a product, a drug to battle anemia. And what anemia is that your blood doesn't have enough iron, so it's, your blood levels are out of whack. And the reason that Celgene had gone to Theranos was that with Edison, a machine with a pinprick that could test blood quickly and give you results back accurately, was important for them because they need to be able to test people's blood often and get a result back quickly to determine how the drug's efficacy was in combating the anemia. Well, what wound up happening was that Celgene determined that the results of the blood draws that Edison was giving them were not accurate. In fact, they actually took it upon themselves to make a PowerPoint presentation, and they sent that PowerPoint presentation to Elizabeth Holmes and to the people running the company, outlining exactly what their concerns were. Ultimately, Theranos could not resolve Celgene's concerns, and Celgene wound up walking away from the deal. So that testimony really, again, designed to go back to what Elizabeth Holmes specifically knew, as opposed to what may have been known by somebody else somewhere down the chain of the company. Other than that, pretty much the extent of the excitement in court. Out of court, more unsealed documents. The one big win for the defense is this. Back in May, the defense had filed some motions to allow testimony regarding this intimate partner violence issue, the battered spouse stuff we were talking about for Elizabeth Holmes and Balwani. So what happens? The government filed their own motion in order to keep the defense from being able to put on an expert witness to testify about how battered spouse syndrome works, okay? The judge has decided that that witness can testify. So if the defense wants, in their case in chief, they have the right to call an expert to testify in front of the jury about what battered spouse syndrome is, and more deeply, how Elizabeth Holmes fits the profile, I presume, of what a battered spouse would be, and therefore, this somehow takes intent away from her and her ability to form the requisite intent to commit fraud. So we shall see how that comes together. They're not obligated to do it, but they now have the right to do it. It is for sure. In addition to just that, we got a bunch of other documents that kind of shed a little bit of light on Elizabeth Holmes' personal life. There were documents that were released today. And again, these were not released in court in front of the jury. These were released to the public. So this is more outside of court stuff that we're seeing in the last day or so. We're also seeing some documents regarding interviews of two former employees that were personal assistants of Elizabeth Holmes. And I think a lot of that talks about how her relationship with Sunny Balwani was viewed internally. Basically, those witnesses said that they were very private people and that Elizabeth Holmes specifically was a very private individual. That's about as much as I gleaned out of it. There were also some documents that were marked sensitive. I found these a little bit ridiculous, to be honest with you, but I'll share them because they were funny to me. The first series were a list of the restocking for Holmes's food preferences. Apparently, it was a big deal that Elizabeth Holmes at some point was vegan and she didn't want to make a big deal about it, so she just requested that there were specific vegan-friendly options available for her at work, and that her house was obviously stocked with those options also. I mean, big deal, but apparently those were marked sensitive at some point for some reason. The second thing that I thought was, between you and me, a little bit ridiculous, but was also marked sensitive was there was a series of emails and documents disclosed from the person whose job it was to make sure that the non-disclosure agreements were all kept track of. And apparently the poor guy that watered the plants outside of the building, he had to have a non-disclosure agreement too. I mean, big deal. I think that what they probably told her was everybody has to have a non-disclosure. And from her perspective, she was doing her job. Anybody that worked for the company had a non-disclosure executed. And this guy worked for the company. Even if his job was watering the plants outside, she had him sign one. Again, I don't think it's kind of a big deal. What I do think is a big deal, and again, stuff that hasn't come into evidence yet, but very well may. I think you're going to start seeing some of this come into evidence as the case progresses. Now that we're in the halfway point, are email and diary entries of Elizabeth Holmes personally. One that I'll just pick out for you that I thought was really strange was that there were a lot of entries that basically indicated that Elizabeth Holmes ascribed, and we all knew this, to Steve Jobs, who was the late founder of Apple. She ascribed him to the point where, I mean, she wears the black turtleneck everywhere, and there were some emails there where she says she wants to be Steve Jobs. Now, I'm going to leave that up to you to determine how you define that statement. Does it mean she wants to be successful entrepreneur like Steve Jobs? Or do you take that to mean she really wants to morph into the man that Steve Jobs is because she's just so infatuated with the guy? I don't know, leave me a comment. Your guess is probably better than mine, frankly. Before I leave you guys, there is one question that was asked during the last video, and I want to share it with y'all. If you remember, I had mentioned that there were a number of witnesses from the media and the press that were listed on Elizabeth Holmes' witness list. And one of the things that I had indicated was it looked like there may be a defense brewing, that this was a witch hunt, and therefore the defense was preparing for that type of a presentation to the jury. Well, somebody asked, why would you put somebody on your witness list that isn't good for you? What good does that do? Let me answer the question a little bit of a different way. The rule of sequestration has been invoked in this trial, and what that means is anybody that is a witness cannot come in to hear the testimony of other witnesses. It is a rule that you can invoke. Both sides normally either ask for it, one or the other asks for it, and the court normally agrees and precludes any witnesses to hear the testimony of any other witnesses. Point is, especially in a complicated trial, you don't want somebody to come in and listen to what the other technical witness says and then come in and testify and somehow either modify their testimony or make changes based on what that previous witness that they heard said. And that's why sequestration of the witnesses is important. I'm not talking about sequestering the jury themselves, just the witnesses. There's a second reason, though, that this may have been done. And I thought about it after this person asked the question. John Carreyrou and some of these other people that are on their witnesses are people that are actively reporting on this case. They actually have a blog that reports on Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes to this day. And I think that the defense, as a way of keeping press coverage to a minimum, put some of these social media types and these journalists on their witness list because now they are witnesses in this case. They can't come into court and listen to the testimony. So that really may be the reason why some of these people appear on the witness list, other than they very well may be part of a defense in the future. So with that, I will keep you posted. Let's see what the judge determines on the next video about what is or is not coming in for Dr. Rosendorff. Again, if you like the video, give me a thumbs up. If you like the series, please subscribe. If you have questions, put them in the comment feed. Again, if you want us to do a live, give me a blood drop emoji. And again, if y'all want us to do it, we're happy to do it, but I just got to make sure there's enough interest to do that topic live, maybe next week. Again, thanks very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you like this content, please share it with your friends. Make sure you subscribe to our page and like our videos. If you want some interaction, get in the comments and we'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to know any more information about our firm or this page, you can find out in the description or visit tragoslaw.com. We post multiple times throughout the week, so make sure you hit that bell so you can get the notification and not miss out on the next episode.